Hi, everybody. You're ready for another installment of Chapter 17, World History. Today we're going to be talking about the section titled Meanwhile in England. In honor of that, I have a good cup of tea today, and it's in a Viking mug. The Viking invasions of England. We're not talking about Vikings today, even though they were vicious. Instead, today we're talking about what happens in England in the 1500s. And it's an incredible story. It starts with something called the War of the Roses, which has been turned into a lot of really great books. Not only that, if you've ever heard of the story Game of Thrones, take the dragons away from Game of Thrones, and it's pretty much England in the late 1400s and early 1500s. The author is an expert on the War of the Roses, and he actually based most of the events in the series on things that happened during the Wars of the Roses. We're talking about the Tudor dynasty today. The Terrible Tudors, as Horrible History, a British history series for middle school and early high school age kids, puts it. It's been turned into TV series, movies, documentaries like this one about Henry VIII and his wives. It's a really fascinating story, and we're going to get into it today. So, what's the deal? We'll start with the War of the Roses. What happened in England was that a king was declared insane without having any children. And so different parts of the family all claimed that they were legitimately next in line to claim the throne. Two different families over the course of decades, two different families consolidated their claims to be the rightful kings. One family were the Dukes of York, and they were represented on their shields with a symbol, the white rose. And then there was another family, the Duke of Lancaster's family, who claimed that they were legitimately the next in line to be royalty, and their symbol on their shields was the red rose. And so that's where we get the name War of the Roses, from these two different families claiming to be the legitimate rulers of England. This struggle went back and forth for decades. It was a horrible time for England. People were being executed for being on the wrong side at the wrong time. It was nasty. It was brutal. It was a very unpleasant time. The War of the Roses ended when the last of the White Rose kings, Richard III, was killed in battle by the Red Rose family's army. And the person who was in charge of the Red Rose family at that time was Henry Tudor, and he claimed to be the next king, King Henry VII of England. So Henry VII actually tried to unite the White Rose and the Red Rose families together by marrying the woman who was closest in age to him and closest in status to him from the White Rose family. So he combined the two into a new dynasty, the Tudor dynasty, whose symbol was actually a big red rose with a smaller white rose in the center of it. So this ends the War of the Roses and starts the Tudor dynasty. Henry VII was a good king. He was a wise king. He was in charge for a long time. He had 2 sons and 2 daughters. He married off his daughters to the kings of France and Scotland. And they had children and continued the royal line in their directions. But in addition to that, he had 2 sons. He had an older son named Arthur, who, unfortunately for him and for England, was kind of sickly. He was never a really healthy young man. And so you have Arthur, a delicate kind of constitution, and then you have his younger brother, Henry. Henry was strong, fit, athletic, intelligent. Henry actually came out and wrote books. He wrote a defense of the Pope when the Pope had been attacked by Martin Luther. And the Pope at the time actually declared Henry as a defender of the faith, a prestigious kind of noble calling from a pope, calling him defender of the faith. So young Prince Henry, he actually was also a tennis pro. He was one of the first people to popularize the sport of tennis anywhere. And English tennis can be traced back, really, to Henry VIII and his interest in it. So you've got Arthur and then Henry. Now, King Henry VII, their dad, was wise, strong, powerful, and he wanted his oldest son Arthur, the next king of England, to get a good bride. So they looked around Europe and they decided to make a deal with the King and the Queen of Spain. At this point, the King and the Queen of Spain are Ferdinand and Isabella. Ferdinand and Isabella don't have any sons, but they have two daughters. And their younger daughter was Catherine, the Princess of Aragon. So Catherine of Aragon would be a good fit for young Prince Arthur of England. And that's what they decided to do. The two families agreed that Arthur would marry Catherine, that she would move to England, become the next Queen of England after Henry VII died. But there's a problem. The problem is that Arthur, as I said before, was never very healthy. As a matter of fact, there were a lot of rumors going around that on their wedding night, maybe they didn't even do anything that would cement a marriage, if you get my drift. So we have Catherine of Aragon, the new princess of England, and a big part of this deal was they wanted to annoy France, because Spain hated France at this time, England hated France at this time. So whatever England and Spain could do to annoy France was a huge benefit. So they cemented an alliance with each other as kind of a raising of the old double finger to the French. But issue. And the issue was that Arthur died young. And there really was never any proof that the two of them had had husband and wife physical relations. So King Henry VII wanted Catherine of Aragon to stay in England. He wanted her to continue to be part of his family. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain wanted the deal that they had worked on to exist after the death of Arthur. And luckily for them, Henry was actually interested in Catherine of Aragon. Prince Henry, Arthur's younger brother, was willing to marry her. The issue is, though, that it goes against the Bible. There's a part of the Bible where it mentions you're not supposed to marry your brother's widow. So they had to go to the Pope and appeal to the Pope to allow Catherine of Aragon to get married to her own husband's younger brother. I have a book here, Henry VIII. It's got some good pictures, and I figure it's about time to show you what young Prince Henry looked like. Here we are, this handsome ginger man, athletic, strong, intelligent. Remember, he'd written the book that got him called Defender of the Faith. This is Prince Henry. And here is the beautiful Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. Now, they did get married, but only after sending the Pope a request to allow them to skip the part of the Bible where it says, don't marry your brother's widow. This man in the center here is the Pope at that time, Pope Leo, and he agreed to let it happen. Interestingly enough, though, he took a bag of cash as well. The English sent a bag of gold as a bribe to allow Henry to get married to his brother's widow. Now, Henry and his marriage to Catherine appears to have been loving. It appears to have been a very good marriage for a long time. She got pregnant a few times, gave birth on one occasion to a boy, and the boy lived for a little while, but not for that long. She gave birth to a daughter as well. Henry had become king by this time. He's Henry VIII, not just Prince Henry. His dad had died, and Prince Henry became King Henry VIII. He had a beautiful daughter, Mary, Princess Mary. But at a certain point, Catherine of Aragon had grown older. She was in her late 30s at this point, and everybody was pretty sure she was not going to have any more children. And Henry needed to have a male heir because his own dad had had to stop a civil war because an old king didn't have a male heir. Henry didn't want England going into a massive civil war over who should be the next ruler. He had no confidence that people would recognize his daughter, Princess Mary, as a legit ruler on her own, because these were very chauvinistic times. Plus, Henry had a couple of mistresses on the side over the years. As king, he had girlfriends on the side other than his wife, and at this point, he was trying to hunt down one of those mistresses and make her physically intimate with him. But she refused. She said, if you want me, you got to put a ring on it. Okay? And so this woman was Anne Boleyn. And because she resisted him in that way, Henry grew even deeper and stronger in his love for her. And he knew he wasn't going to have any more children with Queen Catherine of Aragon. So he asked the Pope to erase their marriage off the record books, to annul the marriage, the same way he'd done to Catherine of Aragon's marriage to his older brother. But the problem was they'd had relations. It was very clear. He'd had several children with her, and the Pope couldn't just do this kind of thing on his own. So Henry appealed to the Pope and said, look, it was wrong for the last Pope to let me marry her. It was a new Pope at this point. And Henry said, look, it was wrong for the old Pope to let me marry her because it goes against the Bible. He should never have done that. So will you put right what the last Pope did wrong and erase this marriage? There were three big reasons why the Pope just had to say no to this request. The first reason was, if he said no to this request and took the bag of cash that Henry was sending this appeal, he sent a bag of cash with this one too, if he took the cash and agreed to it, he would be proving Martin Luther right. Luther at this point was saying the popes are greedy, the popes are corrupt, they'll do anything for a bag of cash. If this new pope agreed to do this, then it would be proving Luther right. And this new pope, Clement, didn't want to do that. Another thing that Pope Clement didn't want to do, reason number two he said no, is because to say that a pope can make a mistake means that popes can make mistakes. And if popes can make mistakes and you're the pope, you don't want to admit that out loud because people are saying you're making mistakes, but you're responding to them by saying popes are God's choice to be the ruler of the religion. Popes don't make mistakes. So by admitting that the old pope made a mistake, he'd be saying that about himself too, that popes are fallible. And this pope here, Pope Clement, did not want to do it. There was a third reason too that he didn't want to agree to this, and that third reason is this guy on the horse right here. This guy on the horse was a big deal. He was Holy Roman Emperor Charles I. He was also the King of Spain, and he was also Catherine of Aragon's nephew. He did not want to allow this marriage to be wiped off the books because that would be an incredible, disrespectful thing for his aunt to suffer. And it would be something that where England would be causing a serious, serious breach of relations with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. So, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, Charles, said to the Pope, you don't want to do this, because if you do this, I'm coming after you with an army, and I will crush you, and I will remove you from your position as Pope. So, Pope Clement, for those three reasons, he didn't want to prove Luther right, that popes are corrupt and would do anything for money, that popes can't be wrong. And if he agrees the old pope made a mistake, then he's saying he could make mistakes. And also Charles V was threatening to remove him from his office if he gave Henry what Henry wanted. He said that he couldn't just make it happen for Henry. He couldn't grant this annulment, that it would have to be something that would be decided in court, and the court would probably decide no. So Henry decided he was going to just become the head of the Church of England. He broke away from the Catholic Church. He forced Parliament to pass an act called the Act of Supremacy, which said that from now on, the Pope is not to be respected. The Catholic Church is not operating in England. From now on, it's called the Church of England. And from now on, King Henry VIII is the only guy in charge of the church. So Henry VIII shut down all the monasteries and sent the monks home. He confiscated all of the churches. He fired a whole bunch of church officials and replaced them with people who'd be loyal to him. He took over the church in England and made it the Church of England. Today we call it the Episcopalian Church, and it's still around. It is the Church of England in England, but most of our U.S. presidents, the first 5 or 6 presidents, were all Episcopalians. They were American Church of England. So Henry VIII got rid of Catherine of Aragon by wiping their marriage off the books. It was basically a divorce. And he kicked her out of the royal family. He separated her from her own daughter, young Princess Mary. He separated her from the English royal court and forced her to go live in a palace all by herself. He then married his mistress, Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne Boleyn was a young, attractive woman, smart, and she ended up controlling Henry for a while. She was the one that said, no, you've got to put a finger on it if you want me. So he got rid of his marriage with Catherine of Aragon, married Anne Boleyn, and she got pregnant soon after. But the problem was she got pregnant with another girl, this time Princess Elizabeth. So he's got 2 girls, no boys. Anne Boleyn was smart and tough, but pushy. And over the course of a while, Henry VIII decided he didn't want her as queen anymore. She was too fussy, she was too upsetting to him, and she wasn't producing him a boy. And so he got rid of that marriage too. And around the same time, he got rid of one of his top advisors. This guy right here is Thomas More. And Thomas More was the author of a book, Utopia, that we talked about last time. Thomas More said, Your Majesty, I'm a Catholic, and I'm not switching religions for you. It's not fair that you're going to ask me to switch religions, so I'm out of here. Well, Henry's response to that, even though Thomas More was a friend of his and a top government advisor, was to behead him. Anyone who wouldn't be loyal to the Church of England was a criminal to Henry, a traitor. And a high-powered, very prominent traitor like Thomas More would not be allowed to survive. After he put Anne Boleyn on trial and had her beheaded for treason against him, he claimed that she was cheating on him, and he also claimed that she was a witch. He had her beheaded, and he married another woman, this time Jane Seymour. And Jane Seymour gave him what he wanted more than anything else on earth. He finally had a boy. He named this boy Edward. It's his 3rd child. There was Mary, who was Catholic, raised by Catherine of Aragon. There was Elizabeth, raised by Anne Boleyn. And there's young Prince Edward. But the problem is Jane Seymour, Henry's wife who gave birth to Edward, died shortly after childbirth. So Henry, he had an heir, but he wanted an extra boy. Because if you remember right, Henry, his own older brother, had died before ever becoming king, Arthur. And so Henry knew he needed an heir and a spare. Neat little way to remember it. Henry wanted an heir and a spare. So he's got his heir to the throne, but he's going to marry again, this time to get a spare. Jane Seymour's dead. He's kind of sick of English girls at this point. He's had a couple of English wives, And he's decided he's going to go outside of England to get another wife, but he has to pick somebody who's Protestant because the Catholics don't want anything to do with them, and he doesn't want a Catholic being his wife and raising their children Catholic. So he's got to look for somebody in Europe, a princess, who is Protestant. And the only places in Europe at that point that had gone pure Protestant were northern Germany and Scandinavia. So Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland. And Henry decides that there's this city-state in Germany that's going to be a good political partner for England. There's going to be a good alliance there called Cleves. And the leaders of Cleves have a daughter. And her name is Anne. And everybody's saying that she's cute, so wouldn't it be great for Henry to marry this woman, Anne of Cleves? He sends his royal portrait painter, Hans Holbein, to go and do a portrait of Anne of Cleves. It turns out being this, and Henry thought, yeah, I'll have that. So he sent a contract, a marriage contract. The family in Cleves agreed to it, and she was sent to England. They hadn't seen each other, hadn't met each other. They'd been pen pals for a very short time. Henry decides to sneak up on her the night before their wedding and see the bride before the wedding, and he's actually not interested anymore. Some people say that she may have been less attractive than her painting. Other people say that maybe Henry was just really particular in the kind of women he was attracted to. But other people say that it possibly could have been that Cleves was no longer necessary as a political ally for Henry, that he'd overcome his need to be their friend, and so his enthusiasm in the marriage had gone off. Either way, he, being the head of the Church of England, still had to go through with the wedding contract, but he didn't sleep with her on their wedding night, and he never slept with her after that, and after several months, he just annulled the marriage, wiped it off the books, and decided to find somebody else. Anne of Cleves actually is probably the happiest story of all of Henry VIII's wives, because the first one was divorced and she didn't want to be. The second one was beheaded. The third one died in childbirth. Then we have Anne of Cleves, who was successfully negotiating with Henry that if she wasn't going to be his wife anymore, at least he could give her a couple of castles and give her money every year. And so she actually came out of the deal really well. The next woman that Henry VIII is looking at, now, by this point, he's like 55 years old. He's completely out of shape. He's no longer the handsome, fit athlete that he was in the beginning of his time as ruler. He gets a 17-year-old hottie to be his next wife, Catherine Howard. She didn't really want it. She didn't want to be tied to this guy who had open leg wounds that wouldn't heal anymore, who had to be carried around in a chair all the time because he ate too much and drank too much and didn't get exercise. She wasn't really looking forward to this, but her family was. Because the Howards were a powerful family in northern England, and they wanted to extend their power into the south, where the capital is, London. To do that, they became relatives of the king and got their own daughter to be the Queen of England. But like I said, she wasn't enthusiastic. She had a miserable time of it. People even say that she cheated on the king. She cheated on Henry secretly. And when Henry's advisors told him about this, after a while he just couldn't ignore it anymore. He had her put on trial for treason, and as a matter of fact, had anybody that she had ever had as a boyfriend before this time also put on trial and executed for treason. And Catherine Howard is executed. Henry VIII at this point knows he probably isn't going to have any more children. He's looking for someone who'll take care of him until he dies. And that is his last wife, Catherine Parr. She didn't want to get married to Henry either, but she knew that he might not last that much longer. Here he is. He's not looking that fit and healthy anymore. So Henry VIII's last wife, Catherine Parr, actually outlives him, and then goes on to marry the guy that she had loved the whole time but was never allowed to marry because Henry wanted her on the side. When Henry VIII dies, the throne goes to his son, the only boy, Edward. Edward is sickly and weak and never married, and when he died, the throne went to his sister, the oldest of Henry VIII's children, Bloody Mary. She gets the nickname Bloody Mary because she'd been raised Catholic and was very upset that England had become a Protestant country. So anybody who refused to go back to being Catholic was beheaded. At this point, she created so many executions, so many martyrs for the Protestant cause, that people named her Bloody Mary. She's where that nickname starts. She dies, though, without any children. She does get married to one of her own relatives. She gets married to the King of Spain. At this point, that's Charles I's son, Philip II of Spain. She gets married to Philip II. He comes over to England once in a while to do his duties as a husband to try to get her pregnant, but it never works. And so Mary ruled for years on the throne, a very unhappy person whose husband wasn't with her, executing people who refused to become Catholic. And then all of a sudden, she stopped having her monthly period. And she got bigger in the stomach. And everybody said, oh my God, she's pregnant. And she thought she was pregnant. But her husband hadn't been to England for over a year. So how could she have been pregnant? Well, people started saying, it's God's child. It's the next Jesus. This is a miracle. And then she died. Because it turns out it wasn't a child. It was a tumor. She had uterine cancer. The tumor got as big as a softball before it killed her. And when she died, her younger sister, Elizabeth, became Queen Elizabeth I, one of the greatest rulers of all time, anywhere, any country. Now, I've talked a while, but we haven't filled in any blanks. So I'm going to do that now with you together. We'll fill in these blanks for Chapter 17, Section 3, Meanwhile in England. Henry VIII, that's VIII, hated Luther and wrote a pamphlet supporting the Pope against him. However, when the Pope failed to erase Henry's marriage off the books, an act called an annulment, he decided to break away from the Catholic Church completely. The Pope said no, and Henry freaked out and had his Parliament, that's the next blank, their version of Congress, write up a law called the Act of Supremacy, which declared Henry the head of the English Church instead of the Pope. Henry decided to remarry after annulling his marriage with Catherine of Aragon, and anyone who tried to stay Catholic who was powerful or important, like Sir Thomas More, M-O-R-E, was executed. Henry ended up having 6 wives because he needed to be sure he got a couple of sons in case one of them died. He ended up with 2 daughters and then a son who was frail and sickly and died young shortly after Henry did. This son was King Edward VI. He punished anyone who tried to go back to being Catholic. When he died without kids, his older sister Mary took over. She was Catholic. She killed people who tried to stay Protestant, getting the nickname Bloody Mary. When she died without kids, her younger sister Elizabeth became queen and set up the Anglican Church, Church of England, which would be a middle ground between being hardcore Catholic or hardcore Protestant like Edward's family was. She didn't execute people just because of their religion. She demanded that everyone at least publicly recognize the Church of England as their official religion, but at home they could be whatever they wanted. There were many plots to assassinate her. For example, the Pope sent monks to go and assassinate her in secret. In England, the King of Spain did the same thing. He sent assassins to try to kill Elizabeth because she was popular and she was leading the biggest, most powerful country in Europe that was not Catholic anymore. She even got her Scottish cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, who's actually going to be in a bonus episode that I'll give you in a little bit, to assassinate Elizabeth, but it failed. Elizabeth tried to rebuild the economy of England so they could have a strong military and also explore outside of Europe and make colonies, like other countries started to do. For example, one of those colonies, Virginia. It's named for Elizabeth. Elizabeth never had kids, never married, never had kids, and so her nickname was the Virgin Queen, and Virginia is named for her. Next time we're together, you're going to get a special bonus episode of Mary, Queen of Scots, an incredible story that was turned into a movie just a couple of years ago. Really, really fantastic movie, and a great story. Very dramatic, very soap opera-like. So, you get a bonus episode on Mary, Queen of Scots. See you soon. Bye-bye.